Hi there, and welcome to our second video in relation to intercultural communication. Now, this week we're going to be talking about some of the more technical aspects of communication in general and how they apply to intercultural situations. But the first thing for us to consider as we think about our own story is, where have you been? As you think about that, consider how the experiences that you've had, whether you've traveled overseas or just in different parts of the country, or maybe you haven't really been out of your own hometown, all of those aspects of your past and your history deeply inform how you see other people. And so bear that in mind as we continue our journey and adventure through some of these ideas. The first thing I want to talk about this week is the benefits of intercultural communication. We looked at some of those last week in relation to the world at large. But think about some of the things that can occur if we have a very astute way of thinking through intercultural communication. The reality is communication is everywhere. Even when people are alone, people are bombarded with communication. Human communication, the ability to symbolize and use language, really is what separates us from the animals. Communication with others is the essence of what it means to be human. It's the vehicle by which people initiate, maintain, and even terminate their relationships with one another. And this process is extremely complex when we break it down. Really, we can think of it in terms of 8 different dimensions. The first of those is a process. A process is anything that is ongoing, ever-changing, continuous. I think any one of us would be able to point to the fact that communication has changed, even in the last 10 years, of how people talk to each other. Think of social media. Platforms like Facebook, which only started in 2004, Twitter in 2007, those 2 platforms alone have changed dynamically the way people address one another and talk about each other. Speaking about dynamism, dynamic is the second point here. Now, the terms process and dynamic are closely related, and part of what makes communication a process is its dynamic nature. Something that is dynamic is active, forceful, constantly changing. Communication is also interactive or transactive because it occurs between people. Communication requires the active participation of at least 2 people simultaneously sending and receiving messages. You are not communicating to anybody if you're just talking out loud and there's no one receiving that information or thinking through that information. Communication is also highly symbolic. Now, a symbol is an arbitrarily selected and learned stimulus that represents something else. Symbols, as we said last week, they can be verbal, they can be non-verbal. Symbols are the vehicle by which the thoughts and ideas of one person can be communicated to another person. Communication is also intentional. Perhaps one of the most debated issues regarding the communication process centers around this idea of intentionality. Intentional communication exists whenever 2 people or more consciously engage in interaction with some purpose. Unintentional communication may also exist, however. The type of communication that we're talking about, though, in this course mostly is intentional communication. Communication is also contextual. Communication is dependent on the context in which it occurs. Now, what do we mean when we talk about context? Well, it's the cultural, physical, relational, and perceptual environment in which communication occurs, which radically affects how people see each other. It's also ubiquitous, which means it's everywhere. Communication is everywhere. It's done by everyone, and it's done all the time. We as people are constantly bombarded with verbal and non-verbal messages. Wherever you go, there's somebody trying to communicate with you. And it's also cultural. This goes without saying. Culture shapes our communication, and communication is culture-bound. People from different cultures communicate differently. Their verbal, non-verbal symbols vary, and are strongly influenced by our culture. Now, one of the things I want us to particularly pay attention to this week is a notion of what we might call communication apprehension. Now, depending on your personality type, where you've come from, how you were raised, your aspect of communication apprehension will vary. When we talk about communication apprehension, we're talking about the fear or anxiety associated with either a real or anticipated communication with another person or group of persons. This is not about being shy or outgoing. This is actually thinking through how we engage with somebody who's different than us. And essentially, there's 4 different types of communication apprehension. There's what we call trait CA, which is a general personality predisposition, as we were saying a few moments ago. There's also context-based CA, which is restricted to a certain generalized context. For example, public speaking or group meetings. You might be fine with talking one-on-one to a particular person, but if you were asked to present a presentation to a group of people in the public space, you might experience that apprehension. There's also audience-based communication apprehension, which is not by the specific context, but by the specific person or audience to one you are communicating with. For example, if you're asked to give a presentation to your boss, as opposed to your peers, you might have a different response. And then we have what we call situational-based communication apprehension, which is experienced really by virtually everyone. It occurs with the combination of a context and an audience. For example, students may feel anxious interacting with their lecturers and professors when they're alone with the professor in the professor's office. All this helps us to see this generalized theme, a contextual model of intercultural communication. As we've seen so far, it takes 2 to tango, as it were. As people are trying to communicate a message, that message is also being received from somebody. And depending on their environmental, microcultural, cultural contexts, all of those things combined, that message may or may not be received by the individual who's communicating and receiving that message. It becomes very complex when we start thinking about the different multicultural environments in which somebody exists. The cultural context is actually the largest circle because the dominant culture permeates every aspect of the communicative exchange. The microcultural context is sometimes the difference between ethnicity, race, language, but they all make significant differences in how we perceive somebody else. Because we have these multiple different contexts, it's important for us to think about the uncertainty aspects that creep into our communication. Let's think a little bit about these fundamental assumptions about intercultural communication. One of those is during intercultural communication, the message sent is usually not the message received. Now, this happens because primarily of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the idea that one's own culture is the center of everything, and all other groups, all other cultures are scaled and related with reference to it. When somebody travels overseas and they encounter a different way of doing things, a different food that people are eating, a different style in which people communicate with each other, the response is often, well, why do these people do it this way? Why don't they do it my way? Now, that's a very subtle but pervasive way of communicating ethnocentrism. If only people were more like me, everyone would be fine. Consider this diagram. Now, we may look at a diagram like this and we chuckle a little bit and we laugh and we make fun of people who think perhaps this way, but there's some truth to the way in which people perceive the rest of the world. Now, whether you're from America or some other country, we all do this to a certain degree. We look at the rest of the world through our own lenses. And so we become tourists of other cultures. We all ethnocentric to a certain degree because we all have our own personal likes and dislikes and things that we feel are normal behaviors. Now, this is true not only in countries, but also cultures and also in businesses. People who join new companies might say things like, I didn't know we did things like that here, or we are used to doing things this way. And that might be reflective of an underlying ethnocentrism. Because we also have a tendency to think that what we do is the right way of doing things. When we're confronted with other ways, we automatically tend to think that those ways must be wrong in some way. For an example, as an outsider, we might view the habits of people living in India, eating food with their fingers, as being dirty or unclean, even though in the West people eat certain things that may even be called finger foods. But anyway, the Indian person views it as clean, as his hands are washed and nobody else has eaten with those hands. But how many people have eaten from the knife and fork that you're about to use? And so the more we understand the way in which different people think, we become more empathetic to the way in which they see the world. That gives somebody else dignity. And dignity is found through respect and the knowledge that regardless of what cultural background I come from, I have a contribution to make, and so do you. Another one of those fundamental assertions is that intercultural communication is primarily a non-verbal act between people. Now, depending on which research you read, some researchers have suggested as much as 90% of all communication is non-verbal. Cultural values, the expression of intimacy, power, status, is typically accomplished non-verbally through what we call paralanguage or paralinguistic cues. Things like proxemics, haptics, oculesics, and olfactics are all elements related to how we communicate non-verbally, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on. Intercultural communication necessarily involves a clash of communicator style. For example, in the United States, people value and employ a very direct and personal style of verbal communication. Personal pronouns are an essential ingredient to that composition of just about any utterance. Many cultures, however, prefer a more indirect and impersonal communication style. In these cultures, there is no need to articulate every message. True understanding is implicit, and coming not from the words but from the actions of the environment. Fourthly, intercultural communication is a group phenomenon experienced by individuals. And what do we mean by that? Well, whenever we interact with a person from a different culture, we carry with us assumptions and impressions of that other person, perhaps stereotypes even, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. The specific verbal and non-verbal messages that we exchange are usually tailored for the person based on those assumptions and impressions. We might say or not say certain things depending on who it is I'm talking to. Oftentimes such assumptions and impressions are based on characteristics of the other person by virtue of their membership in certain groups, for example, their culture, perhaps their ethnicity, their sex, their gender, their age, maybe even their occupation. In other words, we have a tendency to see others not as individuals with unique thoughts, unique ideas, but rather as an Asian person, or a woman, or an old person, or a taxi driver. In other words, we don't see the person, we see the group to which they belong. And finally, intercultural communication is a cycle of stress and adaptation. Now, when we come together with a person from a different culture, we may well feel uncertain, apprehensive, anxious. And those feelings are stressful feelings. And we can learn to adapt to such stress that we eventually grow. And during intercultural communication, we have to be mindful that the communication strategies that we use with people with whom we are familiar may not be effective with people from other cultures that we may be unfamiliar with. Thus, we have to learn to adapt and adjust our communication style. And don't worry, if that makes you feel stressful in and of itself, we're going to be working on some ways in which you can think things through and do that more effectively in the weeks to come.